Hey, due to time constraints, I can only say about half the things that I'd love to say about this book. This is the Devourer below. I'm sure it's in reverse there, but it's a it's actually from a board gaming company. If you've heard of Fantasy Flight Games or Asmodee, they have a series of board games based in the Lovecraftian universe. Excuse me, and some really good games. In fact, there's one called Arkham Horror, the card game, which I highly recommend. Pardon me. There's an Arkham Horror board game, which is also very, very good and can be played solo. And then there's Mansions of Madness, which is excellent. And pretty much all of their Lovecraftian games are good. And I guess they sort of developed this Arkham Horror universe, which is just based on Lovecraft's writings. And by the way, the stories these games tell are really good too. And I think that's, if I'm not mistaken, and I could be, I think that's kind of what inspired this series. There's like 5 of these books. There's short stories, about 9 short stories. So I want to review the first 2 short stories in this book. I might get to the others, I might not. I'm not sure. I'll read the whole book, but I'm not sure I'm going to review all the stories. But I thought it might be fun after reading these and talking about reading a little bit recently that to actually read some fiction and discuss it a little bit. If you're not familiar with H.P. Lovecraft, again, I'm trying to keep these videos short, so I can't say as much as I'd like to say. But if you're not familiar with H.P. Lovecraft, it's horror, eldritch horror. You might want to look up eldritch horror if you really want more details. But it's essentially this world of these old gods that are sort of alien beings trying to come into our world. And there are those who sort of seep into madness and try to help them come into our world. And if they come into our world, destroy us. And it may not sound good, but it actually really is. And these writings are not so inspired by Lovecraft that they're all done first person. They're more like a modern writer's take on these things. And the first story is about these 2 bootleggers. These all take place in the 1920s during the Prohibition era. And the first one's called Running the Night. And the author is Evan Dickin. And this was very good. It was very good. I was very surprised. It's very basic. It's just, again, they're just 2 bootleggers. I don't want to give any spoilers. And they were taking a special shipment out into the backwoods of Arkham. Arkham's a fictional area. If you've heard of Arkham Asylum from Batman, that was inspired by Lovecraft. And so Arkham is sort of the world they're in, where all these stories take place. And it's just like these backwoods. And they had this special whiskey they were taking. And the author does a really good job making he uses a red herring. He makes you think a geographical feature, something for you to worry about. And it distracts you from an ending that I think might have actually been predictable had he not done that. Although I do think the ending was somewhat predictable, but they're supposed to be that way. And what this author did really well is he gave you sort of just a naturalistic problems for the characters to overcome, knowing that the other boot would have to drop at any time. And he knows you know that. And he used that to full advantage. And that was really, really good. Now, the second book, this was done by Georgina Kamsika. I hope I didn't mess that last name up. Man, I have so much I want to say about this. There's just so many things that go into it. And there just isn't enough time. I don't even know where to start. So there was a writer for Star Trek named DC Fontana. And she put initials in her... She used her initials because she was afraid people wouldn't take her serious as a female writer. And her stories are really good if you watch the original series. She has some really well-written stories. My favorite episode of Simpsons was written by a female. It's brilliant. I can't remember the name of it. It's one where Homer, they haven't had the littlest baby yet, and then they want to balance out their life. and he wants to become an employee at the bowling alley. A really, really great episode of The Simpsons. And then obviously Dragonlance. The Dragonlance series I've discussed before on this channel is written by females. It's really, really good. And over the years of reading, I used to kind of have a prejudice about female writers. And then I realized that they can find angles of tension that males just don't see sometimes. And if they're ignored, you actually do so at your own detriment. I do think sometimes there is a disconnect, but I can't speak for anyone else, but for me, between what females tend to focus on sometimes in their writings and what I want out of writings, just to be totally honest. But then sometimes they just hit elements that, especially in Dragonlance, where it's like, I don't think a male would have thought of that, to be totally honest, and I love it. I wish I had time. I'd love to talk to you about, maybe I will another time, about females at seminary and some of the things they would talk about that were just fascinating. So I want to talk about this. I'm going to start with the bad, actually. The bad is I don't think the story is very good. And I'll tell you why I don't think it's very good. It's because, one, there's limited pages, less than 45 pages. That's not much. And the story is way bigger than 45 pages, way bigger. And I'll get that in a minute. That's part of the problem. I didn't like the story. So the story in my mind was just a little bit convoluted. I think if I were to diagram it beat by beat, it'd be kind of all over the place a little bit. That said, the worst thing I have to say about this is probably the best compliment I have to give it to and give this author. This story left the most potential on the table by the end of it. The first half of the last act of the story, I'm using the word act, the last 20 pages, the first half of that is extraordinary storytelling. It is actually, I thought it was almost as good as the end of The Road Warrior, which is saying a lot. It was just organic action that fit into the story. And it was the setting, the way she did the setting, you're just captured by it. I read it real fast. Didn't even realize I was reading. Really, really good. She's a very good author. I have to read some more of her stuff. Really, really good author. But in this particular story, just untapped potential. When you're writing something, sometimes you have to be selective about what you settle in on. You know, you find something that's interesting and you focus on it. And some things you find that aren't interesting, you focus on those things too, because you're going to come back and do a second draft and you can either change those things or just excise them altogether. And the things so I want to say, for me, the things she chose to settle on weren't things that I would have chosen to settle on. But that said, the first story was real basic, right? The tension was clear. It was just, this run has to be done. This bootleg run has to be done. In her story, there was like 4 threads of tension, and they were imminent problems that you wanted solved at all times. These 4 things of tension were going through the entire story. You wanted them solved at all times. She was dealing with the death of her husband. She was dealing with the pressing issue of being stalked. She had a new friend that she wanted to, she didn't really want to get involved in all of this. And by the end of the story, you see it's a big issue that she wants to secure this friend rather than have her life, her get world. And these are just things that I don't think male authors think about too much. I'm not saying they don't, but in my mind, I just wouldn't have thought about these things myself, at least. And I don't read these things in male authors too often. So it was a real fresh take on some things for me. So it was really good to read her stuff here. I was impressed. I also kept thinking, I'm so used to both males and females just, especially this was written in 2021, of just bashing these sort of feminist politics in all their works. And I kept waiting for that to happen, and it never did. She just wrote a good story. Well, and that's the thing. All the fiber of a great story was here. but it was left really just untapped potential. Again, maybe through no fault of her own. And it was nothing to do with her expertise as an author. Her expertise as an author is unquestioned. It was really, really good. It was just she settled in on certain things. So, for example, there's a lot of description about a massage, and it was very well written. It just is an area I personally wouldn't have settled on. And I was like, I don't know. I don't really care as much about this as some other things. Let me give you an example here, because I really want you to see this. This was not the first paragraph, but I want you, zany professor, going to help out. But I do want you to hear this, because imagine if this was the first paragraph of a book you were reading. Lita hadn't taken them seriously, not at first. The stranger is harassing her husband at his butcher's store. What kind of customer wanted to take his shipments? These strange, pale men. What could they do with live meat? But when the same strangers had started to follow them around, harassing them at all hours, Lita had insisted they go to the police. And this came on the heels of her saying that Lita hadn't really taken her husband's problem serious. And that was an evolution where it ended up in her husband's death. So it was a little bit of maybe her blaming herself a little bit, at least tacitly, and then her reflecting on that throughout the entire story. In the end, that part of the story is kind of roughshod at the very end. It is done in a, like, you do get a conclusion for her struggles with the memory of her husband, but unfortunately it's just kind of done, and that's because of the limitations of the short story. Her story could have expanded well beyond 43 pages or whatever it was. It would have been great. And same thing with the first story. The end of the first story, you go, I actually looked in the rest of the book like, is there anything about this character? I want to know, is anyone going to pick this back up at least? I hope not, really, because I wanted the same author to... I've done these projects with other authors before where I'll write a chapter and they'll write a chapter and then I'll write a chapter. And it's fun, but when you look at the overall work, it's a mess. So I didn't want anyone else to pick up on his work, but I wanted his to continue too. So as of right now, first two short stories in this Devourer Below of the Arkham Horror series, I give a big thumbs up. I think it's really good so far. And my expectations were low, to be totally honest with you, because I've read other Fantasy Flight novels and like some of the Android books, and they weren't great. They were not good. I may do a review of some of those. You might find those kind of funny. But anyway, if you're looking for some reading and you like horror, I'm not saying these stories were horrifying. They didn't quite do that. The descriptions were good and all that, and there was lots of tension. But I don't scare easy either. So maybe if you scare a little bit easier than me, you may really get something out of this. But I wanted to say something about it because I'm so pleased with the reading on this. All right, have a great day.